Well, hello. We're here for Q&A. Our Q&A number 107.
Well, you said it without thinking that.
I know. I looked ahead of time. Well, today we're just gonna we were talking about our lineage last time, and we're gonna talk about our ancestors and just say where they came from. And why don't you go first?
We did that one, the ancestors, where they came from.
Well, we're gonna just tell some stories about them. Tell stories how they got here.
Ooh.
Go in more depth.
Oh.
Okay, I'll tell about the Bueller side. My great-great-grandfather, Gottfried Bueller, he came to America. He saw this he was at the dentist or the doctor's, and he saw this pamphlet about about the church, about Joseph Smith, I think it was, and about Joseph Smith, and he says, "Oh, what's this?" The dentist said, "I don't know, you can take it." So he read the pamphlet, and he called the missionaries up, and he says, "I want to join the church." And they said, "Wow, that was an easy conversion." And so he lived over in Switzerland, and he joined the church, and he wanted to come here to America. Every time somebody had joined the church, they always wanted to come to America, to the land of Zion. But he was such a good speaker. They said, "Could you please stay here and speak and help convert others?" So he stayed another 10 years. Then he came over here and settled up in Midway. And that's what you did. You came to America. We're excited to come to America. And anyway, so they settled up in Midway, and that's where he built his own home and then built other homes up there. He still has his home up there. It's some kind of business now. They bought the home. Then that's where my grandfather was born, and then my dad was born here in the Highland. So, and the rest is history. Okay, now you tell a story. Tell maybe about your
long version or short version? Just kidding.
Well, if you can.
Okay, I'll tell you about my parents really quickly. When Brigham Young brought the pioneers over by covered wagon, and they also came by hand carts. And I have two different branches of my family that came by. One came by hand carts, and another one came by covered wagons. The ones with covered wagons, he was actually, his name was Heber C. Kimball, and he was a counselor in the Mormon church to Brigham Young. And Brigham Young was one that headed the pioneer trek here of the Mormons in 1847 is when they first landed here. Anyway, so when they landed in Utah, of course, it's 100% Mormon, and and Brigham Young told my ancestors just to spread out. We're not just going to stay in one little city here, and so my family. She's yawning.
Oh, I fell asleep waiting for him to come downstairs. I'm trying to wake up here.
Okay, and so my grandmother, she went to the University of Utah, and I believe it was called the University of Deseret before that, and she became a school teacher, and she decided I need a job teaching because I've been to college. And so the stake president, he's one of the members, local members, he said, "We would like you to go up to Canada and just see if you like it enough to stay up there for a while."
And fun fact, his grandmother taught up in Midway, and she happened to teach with one of my aunts up there.
Oh, I forgot that.
So it was kind of funny that our ancestors crossed paths for a bit there. I think a couple of years they taught school together.
So my grandmother's brother had already moved up to Alberta, Canada, and was living there. And so she said, "I think I'll go up for 2 weeks and just visit my brother up there." So she went up there to visit him, and she liked it a lot, and she got but one time when she went to mail a letter at the local post office, she saw a good-looking fellow, and he was a cowboy.
It's always how it happens.
He was a cowboy, and the truth was that he was from Draper, which is outside of Salt Lake City, and that's where my Orgo family.
That's where the Orgo family's all settled, was in Draper.
So anyway, they fell in love and they stayed up there 30 years. So instead of coming back to Utah, they bought their own farm out there, and he was my grandfather up there liked to go to stampedes, as they called it, meaning rodeos, and he was good with horses and cowboys and cattle, and that's where. And then they started having children. One of the children was my mother.
What number was she?
I think she was the oldest.
Oldest,
yeah.
okay.
Yeah, so she'd be the firstborn. And they was, I said, were you ever, they rode bareback on horses, and they had coyotes out there that they were a little afraid of, because the coyotes would run in packs. And she said, well, the only thing I was worried is if I'd fall off my horse. I guess I was worried the pack would. I know when she was a little girl, she lived in Salt Lake City, so I think she was born in Arizona. Yeah, she was born in Mesa, Arizona. I just remembered. And anyway, so they started their own family, and then there, about 22 miles away, was another town, Lethbridge. It was the second largest city in Alberta. I was reading about it last night. That's why I know. And my mother was on a little teeny farming town, and that's outside that little town was where their ranch was that they
in
Raymond, Alberta. And
Alberta,
so anyway,
Canada.
so my father is Catholic, from a strict Catholic family, and my mother is from a good Mormon family. My father, he was from Polish or Ukrainian ancestry. He was kind of mean, and so he separated from my grandmother on my father's side and moved to Vancouver. And so that's why my mom and my dad followed them to live in Vancouver, and that's where I was born. And so that's where I spent my first 8 years in Vancouver.
Yeah.
And eventually religion separated them, because after about 7 or 8 years, their parents get serious about which church they're going to be going to. And so that's when we went to California, and then she eventually met a person of her own religion and got married.
In Temple. Yeah, and then my Grandpa Lee, they came from England, and I don't know as much about them, but I just remember he said he saw Grandma Lee, and he says, first day he saw her, he says, I'm going to marry that girl someday. He saw her in a post office, I think. She worked there.
What? No, you're mixing it with my story.
I know, they're very similar. Saw that guy and
in the post
saw
office.
That girl and says, oh, I'm going to marry her someday, and he did. And so it's fun to learn about your ancestry. And one of Joe's ancestors, we'll tell real quick before we close up, his name was Violin Joe. And when he moved, go ahead.
Okay, so Violin Joe, he was one of my ancestors that played the violin, and he loved it, and it was one of the few things he took with him on the handcart. And the handcarts started coming after the pioneers had already settled here. And so they were trying to figure out a fast way, because pulling a big oxen doesn't go very fast, but they figured they could get there faster and cheaper. They wouldn't have to buy cattle and everything. Anyway, they got to the Nevada desert, and Violin Joseph, he's my grandfather's father. He had his wife was pregnant with a little girl, and she got very sick. One of the sicknesses they had was summer fever, I think they called it, and essentially was spoiled food that made them sick. So they would get food poisoning from a lot of the food, because they couldn't. But anyway, so when he's in the middle of the desert in Nevada, northern part of Wyoming, sorry, he wanted to get some penicillin or something, and so the nearest town was quite a ways away, and so he'd have to leave the hand carts while they're pushing on, and he was going to run and catch him after he got the medicine, and he did get the medicine. But it meant he had to sell the violin that he cared so much for. So he sold it, got the medicine, but when he got back, his little baby, Mary was her name, she had already passed away.
They called him Violin Joe. And then...
That's actually the name I gave him.
Oh, was it?
Because
You
there's
named him Violin
three
Joe?
Josephs in a row.
There's a lot of Joseph Orgels. And it's funny how you look like some of them. Of course, they were always bushy with beards and stuff. And then I remember my grandma Lee telling a story about one of her great grandma or something. Her name was Jane. I can't think of it. Anyway, how the Indians were to come into camp and get their food, and she didn't want to give them food one day, and she just said she got a log by the fire and she chased those Indians away. And I remember reading about her just chasing those Indians.
That's a little glamorized story because Indians are wild and they kill. So
oh yeah, so
I'm just saying.
That's why it's quite a story that she chased them off with a log, with a piece of wood, because they normally would kill her.
By the way, my grandmother's father belonged to a band of people to protect the Mormons from the Indians.
Interesting.
And it was called the Black Hawk Warriors. I think they're called Black Hawk Warriors. And I've got a picture of them in the journal where I wrote his life story. And there were Cherokees, Navajo, and one other tribe of Indians that would attack the pioneers and steal their food. They weren't interested in killing him, but if it meant to get to the food, then they would.
He's easy food.
They were starving themselves. It's a desert, and it's not easy to find food.
Yeah, when the Mormons came across out here, they had a lot of trouble with the Indians,
but Brigham Young said it's better to feed them than fight them.
Yeah, he said feed them, don't fight them. And so, of course, here we are now. Today, we live a really nice life, So the ancestors paved the way for you. So it'd be good for you to find out what your ancestors did to pave your path.
So if if your parents or grandparents are still alive,
ask them.
Take a tape recorder with you, because that's what I did with my mother before she passed away. I took a tape recorder and I asked her lots of questions.
Yeah.
Because if that person passes away, all that history in their mind passes away.
The story
with them.
dies with them.
Story
Get
dies
those
with
stories out of them. They think they're not very interesting, but they are.
And mine amounted to about 5 or 6 single-space type. And it took quite a while to type it up, but now my children read that, and I could tell her that my aunt, when she was 2 years old, was eating a grasshopper, and my mother said, "Why are you eating that? You don't have to eat that." A lot of them died from typhoid fever and a lot of diseases that we have conquered today.
Yeah, and we've conquered those. We don't have them here. So it's good to get to know what you came from, and some of the stories are just amazing.
By the way, you can publish those on Amazon. They have free publishing there. Just takes to upload the file and choose what you want the cover to look like. And I've got them all upstairs, and I made copies for each of my children just to pass on where. Yeah,
pass those stories on. The kids love to hear these stories, and tell the stories about your ancestors and find out about them, to find out what makes you you.
Yeah.
And your ancestors have some amazing stories.
The fellow my mother married the second time, he did a lot. He knew how to operate a typewriter, and he did a lot of typing just for different for histories and everything. And
he got you typing.
He got me to type, and there was a place when you're getting
at age 11, weren't you? Or
I came when I was 12.
12.
Yeah, and so. I said, that is so cool, all these histories that we're typing up. And he said, well, you can do it. And I said, well, I don't know how to type, and I've only been here 12 years. But he talked me into it. And so when I was 12, I wrote everything I could remember about my life. And if I had a question, I'd go to my mom.
And ask her
That was when my mother said. But you'd be surprised that your friends and relatives, they would love to read about your growing up and everything.
Yeah, and you never know. who's your guardian angels are, and it's your ancestors. Who else would be watching over you? Like Joe, he felt like he had his guardian angel was Edward, and is Edward the one that got his arm cut off? And
in England.
Yeah, in England, he had a feeling he was at a workshop, and he wanted to walk through.
They were pressing, I think it was a steel workshop or something. They were just pressing a big press, and he had to go around the press, go away to the side, but he said, I can squeeze through here really quick. And he almost heard a voice saying, don't go through here. If you do, take off your coat.
Yeah, he had the thought 3 times, don't go through. And he says, well, I want to go through.
Went through.
At least he took his jacket off.
It grabbed something, and it still sucked his arm in, and he had that amputated.
Yeah, and Joe's always felt that that's been his guardian angel. And
he became a school teacher here in Utah.
A lot of the Orgles were school teachers.
Yeah.
And so, and I know you feel your ancestors around you, to feel that someone's watching over you. You could all tell stories about that.
Sometimes you'll get the distinct feeling that you feel their presence there. You don't hear a voice, or you don't see them, but I remember once, after my father had passed away, my second father, I was driving my truck, and I was thinking about him a lot, how much I carried for him and everything. And I felt he was beside me, and it was so strong that I turned to him, and I started to talk to him. I said, Gene, you know...
you go, I know he's in here, but I can't see him. And you can just feel their presence. And they're your ancestors. They're the ones watching over you. When you pass on and go to the other side of the veil,
they'll be the ones that
you're going to be watching over your kids. Where else would you be?
No, but they'll be the ones that'll give you hugs.
They'll give you hugs. They'll say, and you'll recognize them. And so get to know their stories and get to know who they are. And it's just...
But write it down. Don't just listen to it.
Yeah, write it down.
Either write it down or record it on something.
And if your stories aren't written down, your ancestors' stories, find out where they are, and don't let your story die.
Because if you pass away, if you have any relatives at all, they will never know those things about you when you pass away.
Yeah, my grandmother, Lee, on my mother's side, she was really good at writing stories down, and Joe, he's been writing stories down and getting them
my grandmother
on paper.
And then her parents, she gave me
and got them put in books. And
been here 21 minutes.
Oh wow, we better close up. Yeah, you get talking about your ancestors, and we could talk and tell
Next
stories.
Next time, remind me, and I'll just show them the covers.
Well, I'll post the links below of the books. We'll close with a couple of quotes. Okay, here's a quote. It says, when I hear someone sigh and say life is hard, then answer them back and say, compared to what?
And no matter
your ancestors
how
had a rough
hard your life is, never think, I'd like to trade places with him. He's got money, he's got this.
Don't trade.
Most people you look at, if you knew their troubles, you'd say, I want to trade with somebody else.
Yeah, so make sure you like, comment, subscribe, and find out about those ancestors and get those stories. And make sure you ring that bell, and don't forget about those that brought you to where you are. Thank you, and good night, everybody.
Good night.
And this is a song my Grandma Lee wrote. If you could see your ancestors all standing in a row, if you could see your ancestors, how many would you know? There's Grandma and Grandpa Woodbury and Grandma and Grandpa Lee, and there are so many in our family tree. There's Bueller and Shipley and Croxall and Marr, Kimball and London and Coburn, Loveridge and Pomeroy and Murray, Lowe and Beckstead, Erickson, Wagstaff. If you could see your ancestors all standing in a row, if you could see your ancestors, how many would you know? There's Grandma and Grandpa Woodbury and Grandma and Grandpa Lee, and there are so many in our family tree. I hope that you know who is in your family tree.